Okay, what's up? Welcome to Journey in the Self. I'm your host, Sarah. Today's topic is the mind, friend or foe. This topic came to me as I was, okay, we'll hold for the music. Okay, so here we go. What's up? Welcome to Journey in the Self. I'm your host, Sarah. Our topic for today is the mind, friend or foe. This topic came to me as I was in some meditation at lunchtime. I had I was thinking about what I was going to speak on at first, and as is usually the case, the topic came to me when I stopped thinking, which is relevant to the topic in that many times it is the mind that impedes us on our path. The mind can come between us and that which we want to achieve in our lives. And the mind is also the primary impediment between us being able to be in tune with God and for us to be able to attain union with God. I remember some time ago, I was attending a discourse by a Swami Nityananda, and he was sharing his observations about a study that was done with a an advanced yogi who was being evaluated with an EKG attached to his head to measure his mind waves, his thought patterns and vibrations. And when the yogi went into a deep state of meditation, the EKG machine noted that the yogi's brain waves were almost non existent. The yogi had entered into a deep state of meditation, which would be referred to as samadhi. He had attained to a state where his mind was so still that he had attained union and was in the state of bliss, or the state of samadhi. And in that state, we experience bliss. We experience a profound sense of inner peace. Needless to say, that's not the state most of us reside in. Instead, most of the time, we reside in a state of, or in various states of stress, fear, particularly in this election season, anger, anxiety, frustration, not understanding where these emotions come from. As we were preparing to go on today, I was reflecting on the fact that there's a phrase that many people use uh, in terms of their communications. They talk about, well, I should just speak my mind, or people are encouraged to speak their mind. But when people heed that call to speak their mind, uh, typically what ends up coming out ends up being something that people regret later after it has come out. So speaking one's mind is not necessarily the best thing to do because the mind is unpredictable. So that's not an advisable thing, nor is it advisable for us to allow the mind to go unchecked. So why is this? The state that we're in right now, in terms of our identification, is backwards. We look at things from the outside, and our perception of things is essentially from the outside out. I was initially going to say from the outside in, but that wouldn't be a correct description. The most accurate description is from the outside out. Why do I say that? Because when we identify with what it is that we think we are, we typically look at it from the perspective of our physical being. And we look at us in terms of what we look like first. Then we think about things like our personality traits, and we identify our physical and emotional state uh, as being who we are. We'll identify with our intellect. Many of us become proud of our intellect, particularly as we could become more and more learned or attain any type of educational degrees. And so we'll get our egos inflated by the different titles that we might be able to put on at the end of our names or at the beginning of our names. And we identify those things as who we are. And then we look at the outside world from that perspective, from the perspective of what the senses can take in. And so from the outside out is the nature of our perception of ourselves and of the universe. But that's not who we are. We are not the mind, we're not the body, We're not our emotions. Those are all things that we use in order to have this experience in this physical realm, but that is not who we are. And we identify with the mind, which is an extension of our ego self. When I say that it's an extension of our ego self, the ego self is the perception of ourself, which I just described, looking the entity that's looking at the world and the universe from the outside out. The ego self is the accumulation of our experiences. Is built by the observations and influences that we've had from our family, from our upbringing. It's developed based upon our interpretation of things that have occurred and that we've interpreted as happening to us. It encompasses our reactions to those things, how we've processed it, the emotions that is created within us, emotions that we've held on to, experiences that we've held on to. And so it just continues to build throughout our lives as we gain experience. But as that ensues, we're just building upon different layers that end up expanding and creating a bigger buffer between us and our true nature, our spirit self. And we get farther and farther from identification with our self as long as we continue to look at things from the outside out. And one of the principal things that contributes to that is the mind. So the mind is the source of all of our emotions. And the mind is also that is a tool of creation. That which we think about, we bring about. That which we think on most intently with focus, added with emotion, we bring it to pass, whether it's positive or negative. Whatever it is that we focus on with intensity, positive or negative, ends up being that which we manifest into our lives. And so when we go back to the topic, the mind, friend or foe, we must be mindful, if you will, of what it is that we're thinking about and how it is affecting our state of being and how it ends up affecting our experience. The other thing about the mind is that typically when people, before people embark on a spiritual path, and even often after people have embarked on a spiritual path, people typically are not in control of what is coming into our minds. We let the mind operate unabated without seeking to be in control of it. And so the mind just operates unimpeded and ends up being something that controls us. And when I said earlier, it is an agent of ego, the ego self is gets fed, as I explained, by building layers and layers and layers based upon the nature of our experiences and how we've interpreted those experiences, the emotions that we experience as a result of those experiences. And it influences our actions and even triggers emotions based upon what we're experiencing in the moment. Our reactions aren't based upon what's happening in the moment, it's based on things that have happened in the past. But it's the mind that triggers those things. And so as the ego ends up growing, its primary tool to control us is the mind. So basically, we end up, particularly when we embark on a spiritual path, we end up in a battle between our ego self and our higher self. And those of us who are familiar with the Osirian drama in the Kemetic spiritual pantheon, it represents the battle between Heru or Horus and Set. Heru being the higher self who wants to identify with his higher self, his father, God, or Asar, Osiris, and fighting him from being able to achieve that is the lower self or Set, who represents the ego. So at any given moment, we're, particularly once we embark on the spiritual path, we're in a battle for control. Ego having gained control because of the fact that we are not educated in terms of who we truly are in our early life. We've gone through most of our life with the false identification of who we are as being the ego. And so when we embark on the spiritual path, then we're we've entered into a battle to wrest control of ourself, to wrest control of our senses, to wrest control of our mind, to wrest control over our body from the ego. But the ego, without our awareness, typically will have control over the mind and will send thoughts to us to help it to be able to retain control. Okay, so typically those thoughts are going to be thoughts that would invoke a negative emotion, to send us into a negative emotion. And so if we are not in a state of awareness and haven't developed a state of awareness, then the mind can be a great enemy to us because it will seek to control us by keeping us on a negative thought pattern, which will keep us in a constant state of negative emotions. And then often it will use as weapons the past experiences that we have interpreted as being negative, that have invoked in us negative emotions, that have created pain and trauma for us in the past, and it will bring it into the now. So as I was meditating on the topic for the day, it brought to mind some reflections that came to me in my own introspection and of observation of myself, as well as in the observations that I've had of others, where I've noticed when I was reacting to things and my reactions were not so much based upon what I was experiencing in that moment, but my reaction and the emotions that I experienced were triggered, if you will, or influenced by some past experiences. And so I took note of those things. And it compelled me to exert more effort to be in the present moment and to not allow myself to be affected by what has occurred in the past, to what caused me pain in the past, to instead be present and be in a position to be able to choose how to respond or not to respond at all based upon what's happening in that particular moment. And that ends up becoming important because it will have an effect on the interactions that we have with others. Because other people are going through the same thing on different scales, and it'll be different to the extent that people have had different experiences. But for the most part, most people are living either in the past and being influenced heavily by things that have happened in the past, and are also influenced based upon their anxieties about what may happen in the future, which is largely affected by their past experience. And so the future projection about what may happen in the future is based upon what has happened in the past. And then by allowing ourselves to be caught up in anxiety about what may happen in the future based upon the fears that we've developed from our past experiences, then we end up choosing actions that essentially makes the things that we're anxious about come to pass because we're focused on those things. We're influenced in the now into taking actions that will act to create the very things that we're afraid of because of the fact that we're focused on those things with our minds, and then we're reacting to them based upon what we fear. And then we're not conscious of how our actions then may affect the people that we're interacting with. Because the typical situation is that the other person is going to interpret our actions based upon their own past experiences, their own fears, their own triggers. And so we'll have two people who are just reacting to each other, and neither of them are operating based upon what's happening now in the present moment. And all of this is because of what's going on in our minds. If we were to take the time to engage in some observation of ourselves, to just step back and observe ourselves and observe what's going on in our minds, we'll notice how the mind will have a tendency to jump from thought to thought to thought to thought. Very infrequently is the mind able to maintain a single train of thought. And if you pay attention to, just observe someone who talks really fast. If you just observe someone who talks really fast, you'll notice that more often than not, they are they have a very difficult time being able to stay on a particular train of thought. The things that they talk about will will jump around from subject to subject. And that ends up being a representation of how their mind works. Okay, so if we observe, and let's just keep it to observing ourselves, because our responsibility is uh, to observe ourselves and to develop control over ourselves, because we can't control anyone else. We can only influence them, but we want to influence people positively by setting a positive example. And we can only do that to the extent that we're exercising control over ourselves, principally control over our minds. So we talked about how the mind is a tool of creation. And as such, it's important for us to maintain control over our mind, because whether we're conscious of it or not conscious of it, we are creating with our minds all of the time based upon that which we are thinking about. And if we're thinking constantly about things that have occurred in the past, then we're not able to be fully present and to operate in the current moment, and thus will not make the most appropriate decisions based upon what's going on right now. Earlier today, I was speaking to someone, and it was kind of a random thing, but as I pointed out in uh, the Funkadelic song "Good Thoughts, Bad Thoughts," there's no chance, coincidence, or accident. It happened that a woman on my job sought me out. Never, I don't know how she got my number, but she found me on. All right, the company that I work for, the agency I work for, is directory. And she reached out to me because a friend of hers was interested in a job posting that my office has. And so she wanted me to help her out with getting her friend able to apply for the job. And so I spoke to her today. And the first thing that she did upon getting on the phone with me was to express all of her fears and reservations about applying for the job. First, she was concerned about the pay and whether the pay would be commensurate with her current lifestyle. And she was anxious about whether the agency would pay her commensurate with her work experience. She was concerned and anxious about whether the nature of her experience was appropriate for our job. She questioned whether she was qualified for the job. And so I sat and listened to her for about 20 minutes. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. 15 minutes, we'll say. Well, I think it was actually 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. So I listened to her for about 15 to 20 minutes, expound on all the fears that she had about applying for the job. And it had gotten to where all those fears and negative thoughts had almost gotten to the point where she allowed it to discourage her from applying for the job. So after she was finished, I asked her if she wanted some input from me. So she thanked me for listening to her. And when she accepted um, the offer for input from me, the first thing I told her was to not allow herself to make decisions based upon her fears. And I invoked the often repeated phrase that fear is false evidence appearing real. But I also shared with her my own personal definition of fear, which is fear is the expression of faith in a negative outcome. I repeat that. Fear is the expression of faith in a negative outcome. The reason I say that is that when someone experiences fear, it is because they believe that something negative is going to happen. Because if they did not believe that something negative was going to happen, they wouldn't be in fear. And so she considered that, and she thanked me for it. And then I went on to explain to her, how everything that she said was actually wrong, because the my agency would view her highly based upon the nature of her experience, which she expressed to me. But the point of me sharing that story was that based upon her fears, she had projected a story about how things were going to unfold. And they became so real to her that they were about to dissuade her from applying for a job that she wanted. And in this particular situation, she lives in another state and she has relatives here in California. And she wanted to really deeply wanted to move back here to Southern California to be with her family. But her fears almost prevented her from applying for a job that she desperately wants, which would help her to be able to facilitate her move back to California. But none of those things were true. They were all projections from her mind, which created fear and anxiety for her. But it was all in her mind. She created the anxiety. She was creating stress for herself, all in her mind. So I encourage you to observe your mind and notice what happens to your mind. Notice how your mind jumps from thoughts to thoughts to thoughts. And then notice when a thought will lodge itself within our consciousness. Notice, and as the song goes, good thoughts, bad thoughts. Be careful of the thought seeds that you plant in the garden of your mind. Notice when a thought seed gets planted in the garden of our mind, and then we begin to water it by feeding it with attention. And then notice as we're giving energy to that thought and allowing it to grow, notice how it ends up affecting our mood. And it could be either, again, a good thought or a bad thought. Okay. If it's a good thought, we'll typically be happy. But that's not usually what happens, because the ego tends to be in control of our minds. And so the most potent emotions that allow for us to be controlled are negative emotions, such as fear, anger, anxiety, stress. And here on election eve, we see how the use of those emotions that I just mentioned are evoked in the process of the advertisements, the phrases that are used by the candidates in the campaign trail to trigger negative emotions to control people. And when people get caught up in negative emotions, their actions become irrational. And so they do things that don't make sense. Okay. And so we've seen that. You guys, if you're paying attention, if you guys are aware, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But that is happening on a wider scale. But as the saying goes, as is above, so is below. It's also happening to each and every one of us individually, continuously. But it's not the enemy out there, it's the enemy within the ego self that is using the arsenal that it has in order to be able to retain the control that it has always had and exerted over us. And as I made the distinction between us embarking on the spiritual path and not, when we embark on a spiritual path, we've declared war on the ego. And the objective of the war is to wrest control from our ego over its dominion over our mind, body, senses, and our emotional state. And so when we declare war on the ego, then it will fight harder to retain its control. And so that's why it seems to us when we've embarked on the spiritual path that life becomes more difficult for us. Last night, I was listening to a discourse from our senior Swami, Swami Amrita Swarupananda Puri, uh, Amma's senior disciple, and he made a point to express how many of us who have embarked on a spiritual path, particularly in the beginning, will perceive that life has become more difficult for us once we've embarked on that spiritual path. And it appears so for two reasons. One is that now we've become aware of ourselves. We're developing awareness, and so we're starting to be able to observe and see some of the things that are happening to us. We're able to be able to see where we are slowly, because that doesn't always, happen to everyone, instantaneously. We won't notice it that right away, but as we continue on our path, we become more and more aware of things, and so we start to notice the tendencies that we've had, the what are called vasanas, um, our negative tendencies, and the things that have developed within us that become habitual habits, things that we just continue to do because we've always done those things. whether they benefit us or not, we've never really even taken it into consideration as to whether it benefits us or not. And so as we start to become aware of these things, then we make it a point to try to transcend them. But it takes time in doing that, and it takes time to also be able to develop awareness. But it's important, it's imperative that we begin to develop awareness and have awareness of what our minds and what we're thinking about at any given moment, because it is our responsibility to do that, to gain control of ourselves. That's what the journey into self is all about, is realizing, coming to the realization that the body, the mind, the senses, and particular the mind is not who we are. And so it's to transcend our identification with those things as being who we are, and withdraw from the tendency to allow those things to control our actions, to allow our senses to control our actions, and to allow our bodies to control our actions, to allow our minds to control our actions, because that's where it starts. And so, if we're not maintaining constant awareness of our minds, then the mind can be a great foe, because it will be manipulated by the ego to influence us into making poor and often irrational decisions that are not consistent with our spiritual path, and are not congruent with what's going on in the current moment. And so then it again appears to be an irrational decision based upon what the current circumstances are. And that's what a lot of people end up experiencing in terms of their uh, interactions in relationships, where either one or both people are experiencing the now based upon and interpreting the now based upon what things have happened to them in the past. And so it ends up becoming like a ping pong match where people are just reacting and reacting and reacting with nobody being present. And then, so obviously that's not going to work. Both people will be miserable, or one person will have some awareness, but the other one doesn't. Um, and so, there there develops some frustration. But part of compassion is being able to recognize and relate to what the other person is going through. And that can be a very challenging thing to do, particularly if we don't have the wherewithal to be able to be in control of our own minds. And if we're not in control of our own minds, then we'll just find ourselves just in that back and forth reaction mode with no one able to be able to bring levity to this situation. So we want to be able to stop that cycle. We may not and probably won't be able to do that for others. But if we're doing it, we can maybe provide a positive example for them to the extent that we have developed some measure of control of ourselves, control over our own minds, control over our own actions, and then through compassion, understand that what people are doing at any given moment isn't about us, and have the wisdom to not make it about us, and have the compassion to realize that they are reacting and being triggered by things that have happened to them in the past that have created trauma for them. Now, that's not to say that if we find ourselves in that situation, we have to stay there and deal with that. Um, but we just hope and pray that um, that person, is able to be able to develop an awareness, um, and so we hold space for them and pray for them, and hope that they can overcome the trauma that they've experienced in the past, and be able to learn to reside in the moment. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for others. But we have to take it on. If we want to grow and learn to be able to transcend our identification with the mind, and more broadly, to be able to transcend our identification with our ego self. And so, as we begin to transcend that identification, then we can transform the mind from a foe to a friend. Because with the mind, we can create. And when we've harnessed the mind, then it can become and will become a powerful ally, because then we will use the mind in order to be able to create things that are consistent with our goals and aspirations. And we would be able to transcend the mind to bring it to a level of stillness that I described when I was giving the example of the yogi, that we can begin to gain such control that we can bring the mind to a state of relative stillness, to where we can be guided rather by the intuition than by the influence of the ego or our lower self. And so with that, I'll conclude. I hope that you found this to be beneficial and that you'll listen to this and contemplate and reflect on it. And it'll take some digestion, but it's worth reflecting on and to meditate on, and to give time to some self-reflection and introspection, because that's what's necessary for us to be able to understand or understand uh, what we've been identifying with as ourselves, and to begin the process of transforming our identification with ourselves to that of from the ego to our identification with our true self, which is eternal consciousness. And that's where we want to be. And that is the objective of the journey into self. So with that, thank you for tuning in, and please do um, play this over and over as you go to YouTube and where the recording will be, and take it in. And I think you'll find it to be a great benefit. So again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time here on Journey into Self. Hotel. Oh, and if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on my website, www.sa-ra.org. That's www.sa-ra.org. And you can set up a free um, counseling appointment with me, and then we can discuss how I might be able to be of service to you. All right. So thank you for tuning in, and see you next time on Journey Yourself. Hotel.